The day my mother-in-law walked into my parents' living room, sat down like she owned the place, and said she wanted a copy of the house keys, I felt something shift inside me that I've never been able to fully describe. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, something that said this woman has been building toward this moment for years, and she finally felt confident enough to say it out loud. I want you to understand what kind of person my mother-in-law, Diane, really is. Not the version she shows at family dinners, the one who compliments your food while slowly poisoning the room, the real version. Diane is the kind of woman who has spent 40 years perfecting the art of control. She has a smile that never quite reaches her eyes and a way of asking favors that makes them feel like commands. She raised her son, my husband Marcus, to believe that her happiness was his responsibility. And for a long time, Marcus believed her. When Marcus and I got married 6 years ago, I thought Diane's behavior toward me was just a typical mother-in-law adjustment period. She made small comments about how I cooked. She would rearrange things in our home when she visited. She once told me with that signature smile that she hoped I understood what Marcus had sacrificed by choosing me. I told myself it was harmless, that she would eventually accept me, that time would soften her. I was wrong about all three of those things. The first real sign of how deep the problem went came about 2 years into our marriage. My parents were visiting from out of town, staying with us for a week. Diane showed up unannounced, which she did regularly, and walked in to find my mother in the kitchen making tea. The look on Diane's face was something I will never forget. It wasn't surprise, it was something like offense. She pulled me aside later that evening and told me in a voice carefully designed to sound casual that she felt uncomfortable with my parents being at the house when she hadn't been given notice. Our house, mine and Marcus's house, the house she had not contributed a single dollar toward. I mentioned this to Marcus that night. He patted my hand and said his mother just needed time. That was the response I would get in some version or another for the next 4 years. His mother just needed time. But Diane wasn't waiting for time, she was building something. She started calling Marcus every single day. Long calls that happened to always come right when we were eating dinner or sitting down together in the evenings. If Marcus didn't answer, she would call back within 20 minutes. If he still didn't answer, she would text him something designed to create guilt, something like, "I just wanted to hear your voice, I hope everything's okay." Marcus could not see the pattern, or maybe he chose not to. He had spent his entire life learning that the way to keep peace with Diane was to give her what she wanted, and that pattern was not something he was going to dismantle just because his wife was frustrated. So I stopped saying anything. I learned to manage my own reactions, to keep my relationship with Diane civil, and to build a life that had healthy boundaries around it, even if Marcus wasn't always the one enforcing them. Then my parents bought a house in our city. My parents had always been renters. My dad worked in manufacturing for 30 years and my mom was a school administrator. They weren't wealthy, but they were careful and patient, and after years of saving, they finally did it. They bought a small but beautiful home about 20 minutes from where Marcus and I lived. I was overjoyed. My parents and I are close in the way that only happens when your family actually shows up for you. My mom came to every one of my doctor's appointments when I was dealing with a health scare 2 years ago. My dad helped me move 4 times before I finally settled down. They are the kind of parents who never made me feel like a burden, and I would do anything for them. Diane did not take the news of my parents' purchase well. I noticed it at first in the way she started asking questions. How big was the house? What neighborhood? Whether they had a garage? She asked Marcus these things, not me, which told me everything I needed to know about why she was asking. She was calculating something. Within a month of my parents moving in, Diane had dramatically increased the frequency of her visits to us. She started suggesting that we all spend weekends together as a family, which always meant her definition of family, herself, Marcus, and ideally me looking grateful to be included. She began making comments about how nice it must be for my parents to have their own place now, said with a particular emphasis that implied she felt some kind of equality had been disrupted. And then came the afternoon that changed everything. My parents had invited Marcus and me over for Sunday lunch. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where you eat on the patio and stay longer than you planned because the conversation is good. My mom had made her slow-cooked lamb, which is the kind of meal that makes you feel genuinely cared for. We were all happy. It was a good day. Diane arrived 45 minutes after we did. Nobody had invited her. Marcus had mentioned casually to her the week before that we were having lunch at my parents' place. He had mentioned it the way you mention something to fill a silence, not the way you extend an invitation. But Diane had heard it differently or pretended to. She walked in through my parents' front door, which had been left unlocked because it was a warm day and we were moving back and forth to the patio, and she greeted everyone with the kind of enthusiasm that was slightly too loud to feel natural. My mother, because she is one of the most gracious people I know, welcomed Diane warmly. She set an extra place at the table. She offered her food and drinks. She was, in every way, a perfect host. Diane ate the food. She complimented certain things with qualifications. She told a long story about her own cooking that nobody had asked to hear. And then, when the table was being cleared and people were settling back into their chairs with drinks in hand, Diane made her move. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing. She turned to my mother with that smile and said that since we were all practically family now and since she visited the area so frequently, it might make sense for her to have a key to my parents' house. For convenience, she said, for emergencies. The table went quiet. I felt Marcus go still beside me. My father put down his glass. My mother's expression shifted in a way I recognized. It was the expression she gets when someone has surprised her so completely that she needs a moment before she responds. Diane kept talking into the silence. She said something about how having a key would mean she didn't have to burden anyone, how she could let herself in if she arrived early, how it was really just practical. She used the word family 3 times in 4 sentences. My mother said very kindly that she would think about it. After Diane left, and she left shortly after, almost as if she had accomplished what she came for and was satisfied, my parents and Marcus and I sat in the living room. My father looked at me. It was the kind of look that said he needed me to explain what had just happened, because what had just happened was beyond his understanding. I didn't know what to say. I looked at Marcus. Marcus said he was sure his mother hadn't meant any harm. He said she probably just wanted to feel more connected. He said we should try to be generous in how we interpreted it. I excused myself and went to help my mother in the kitchen. I stood at the sink with her and we didn't say anything for a moment. Then she looked at me and said quietly, "I am not giving that woman a key to my home." I nodded. I told her she absolutely did not have to. But I also knew Diane, and I knew this was not going to be the end of it. I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Diane brought it up again in 3 separate conversations. Once to Marcus, once in a group text that included me, and once in a phone call she made directly to my mother under the pretense of asking for her lamb recipe. Each time, she framed it slightly differently. Once it was about safety. What if there was an emergency and nobody could get there in time? Once it was about practicality. She was in the area so often now that it just made sense. And once, in the most revealing version of the request, she said that she felt a little excluded sometimes and that something small like this would help her feel more welcome. That last version is the one that showed me exactly what this was about. Diane didn't want a key to my parents' house because she needed access to it. She wanted a key to my parents' house because my parents having a place that was entirely their own, a place where she had no standing, no access, no control, was intolerable to her. My parents' home represented a part of my life that she couldn't reach, and she had decided to reach for it. I started paying closer attention to everything Diane said and did around this time. I began to notice things I had rationalized away for years. The way she would ask Marcus about our finances under the guise of concern. The way she would mention, in passing, that her other son, Marcus's older brother Daniel, had given her a key to his home and that it had worked out so well. The way she positioned herself as central to any plan, any gathering, any decision, and then acted wounded if she wasn't consulted. I also started noticing something about Marcus. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work or bad sleep. The kind that comes from spending years managing someone else's emotional demands. I could see it in the way he braced himself slightly every time his phone rang and it was his mother. I could see it in the way he always needed a few minutes to decompress after her calls. I could see it in the way he defended her reflexively, not because he believed the defenses, but because questioning her was more exhausting than protecting her. Marcus loved his mother, but he was also, I was starting to understand, afraid of her disappointment, afraid of her hurt, afraid of the person she became when she felt she wasn't getting what she expected. I decided to have an honest conversation with him, not about the key specifically, but about the pattern, about the years of it, about what I had been managing quietly because I didn't want to make him feel caught between his mother and his wife, and about the fact that I couldn't keep doing that indefinitely. We talked for a long time that night. It was not an easy conversation. Marcus pushed back on some things. He defended some of his mother's behavior in ways that frustrated me, but he also listened. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, he said something that surprised me. He said, "I know she does this. I've always known she does this. I just didn't know what to do about it." That was the first time in 6 years that Marcus had acknowledged it without qualification. I didn't push. I didn't demand immediate action. I told him that I trusted him to figure out what he needed to do and that I would support him in whatever that looked like. But I also told him clearly that my parents' home was not Diane's to access, and that whatever response came from our side of this needed to make that clear. He agreed. What happened next is where this story takes a turn I did not expect. A few days later, I got a phone call from Daniel, Marcus's older brother, who I had always liked but wasn't particularly close to. Daniel is quieter than Marcus, more reserved, and he tends to stay out of family drama whenever possible. So when he called me specifically, not Marcus, I knew something was off. He asked me how things were going. He made a little small talk, and then he said carefully that he'd heard his mother had been asking about a key to my parents' house and that he wanted me to know something. He told me that when Diane had asked him for a key to his house years ago, he had given her one. He told me that she had used it, not for emergencies, not for practicality. He said he had come home one day to find that she had gone through his and his wife's bedroom. Not ransacked, nothing was missing, but things had been moved, looked through. She had gone through his wife's personal things. He said they had taken the key back. He said his mother had never acknowledged what she'd done. He said the incident was one of the reasons his wife and Diane had such a strained relationship now. I sat with that information for a long time after I hung up. I wasn't surprised exactly, but hearing it confirmed something I had suspected without being able to prove. Diane didn't want access to places because she needed access. She wanted access because she needed to know, she needed to see, she needed to feel that no space existed that was hidden from her. I told Marcus what Daniel had said. I watched his face as he processed it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his brother, and they talked for almost an hour. I don't know everything that was said in that call, but when Marcus came back, something had shifted in him. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had just realized he was allowed to set it down. He told me he was going to handle it. He called his mother the next day. I was not in the room for the call because I deliberately gave him that space, but he told me afterward what he said. He told her, calmly and directly, that the key to my parents' house was not going to happen. He told her that my parents' home was theirs alone and that it was not appropriate for her to have asked and that she needed to stop asking. He told her that he loved her but that there were boundaries in their relationship that had gone unaddressed for too long and that he wanted to address them. Diane's response, Marcus told me, was to cry, to say that she had never meant any harm, to say that she didn't understand why everyone was against her, to say that she had done nothing wrong and that she was being treated like a criminal for wanting to feel like family. Marcus did not backpedal. He stayed calm. He said he understood she was upset and that he wasn't trying to hurt her, but that the answer was still no and that he meant what he'd said about boundaries. After he hung up, he sat quietly for a moment, and then he looked at me and said, "That was the hardest thing I've ever done." I believed him. Diane did not respond well in the weeks that followed. She went through a phase of wounded silence, not reaching out to Marcus, waiting for him to come to her and apologize. He didn't. She sent a few texts that were designed to communicate hurt without saying it directly. He responded to them kindly but without giving her what she was looking for. She called Daniel and apparently had a dramatic conversation with him about how her family no longer valued her. Daniel called Marcus afterward and told him he was proud of him. About 3 weeks after Marcus's phone call with Diane, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. My mother called me one morning and said that Diane had reached out to her directly, that she had called my mother's personal cell phone, a number she had apparently got from somewhere, and had apologized. She said she had realized she had overstepped. She said she genuinely hadn't meant to make my mother uncomfortable. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. My mother, who is far more generous than I am, accepted the apology gracefully. She told me about it afterward with a look that was not quite convinced but not quite suspicious either. She said, "I hope she means it." I said I hoped so too. But I also told my mother something I had learned over 6 years of living adjacent to Diane. I told her that an apology from someone who has never been made to face consequences before is not the same as a changed person. It might be genuine, it might be a temporary retreat. The only way to know the difference was time. My mother changed her locks 2 months later, not because of any specific incident, but because she was having her front door replaced and it gave her the opportunity to start fresh with new keys. She mentioned it to me afterward, almost as an aside. She didn't make a production of it, but she met my eyes when she said it and we both understood what she meant. What changed most significantly after all of this was not actually about Diane. It was Marcus. The version of Marcus who emerged from that conversation with his mother and from the weeks of holding the line that followed was different. Not dramatically, he didn't suddenly become a different person, but there was a quality in him that I hadn't seen before, a kind of calm that didn't come from avoiding the problem but from having faced it. He started answering his mother's daily calls every other day, not to punish her just because that was what felt healthy to him. He stopped explaining and justifying himself to her. When she would make comments that were designed to create guilt, he would say something brief and non-reactive and change the subject. He was kind to her, but he was no longer managed by her. I watched this and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in our marriage, something that felt like relief. We had a conversation around this time, one of those late-night conversations that happen when everything else is quiet, where Marcus told me that he had spent most of his adult life feeling like he had to choose between his mother's version of love and everything else. And that choosing everything else had felt like an act of disloyalty. And that he was starting to understand, for the first time, that love that requires that kind of choosing isn't actually the thing it claims to be. I didn't say anything, I just held his hand. Diane came to Christmas that year. It was the first time the whole group was together since the key incident. Me, Marcus, Daniel and his wife, my parents, and Diane. I was genuinely uncertain how it would go. What happened was quiet and unremarkable, which in this context was extraordinary. Diane was polite to my mother, genuinely polite, not the performance version. She didn't dominate every conversation. She didn't make comments with edges. She sat at the table and participated in the meal like a person who understood that her role in this room was the same as everyone else's and not more than that. I don't know whether that was real change or whether she was simply recalibrating. I probably won't know for a long time. But I know this, my parents' home has remained entirely theirs. My mother has never been made to feel like she needed to justify what happens inside her own front door. And there is a key hanging on a hook just inside my parents' kitchen, one of the new ones from the new locks that has my name on the tag because my mother gave me a copy the day she moved in and we both laughed about it. This small, ordinary thing that felt like it meant something after everything that had happened. A key is just a piece of metal. But what a key represents: trust, access, belonging. Those are things you earn. Those are things that take years of showing up honestly, of respecting other people's spaces and boundaries, of understanding that you are welcome in someone's life and that welcome is not the same as ownership. Diane never understood that. Maybe she's beginning to, maybe not. But I finally stopped waiting to find out, and that, more than anything, is what changed everything. That was the part I had to sit with honestly. I had told myself I was being patient and mature, and partly that was true, but partly I had been afraid that if I drew a firm line, Marcus would resent me for it, afraid that I would be painted as the difficult daughter-in-law who couldn't get along with his mother, afraid that the story Diane would tell about me, the one she had been quietly constructing since the day Marcus introduced us, would become the story everyone believed. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always look like fear from the inside. Sometimes it looks like tolerance. Sometimes it looks like keeping the peace. Sometimes it looks like being the bigger person. And you can spend years believing you're choosing grace when really you're choosing silence because silence feels safer than the alternative. I had to forgive myself for that. That took longer than forgiving Diane. Marcus and I started seeing a couples therapist around this time, not because our marriage was in crisis, but because we both recognized that we had built certain patterns into our relationship that had been shaped by years of managing his mother, and we wanted to unpack those patterns before they became permanent. It was one of the best decisions we ever made together. Our therapist was a calm, direct woman named Patricia who had a talent for asking the one question you hadn't thought to ask yourself. In our third session, she asked Marcus what he had learned about love from watching his mother love him. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said that he had learned that love came with conditions, and that the conditions were always shifting, and that the safest thing to do was to keep trying to meet them. Patricia asked him if he thought that was what love actually was. He said no, but he said it had taken him until his late 30s to understand the difference between what love is and what he had been taught love looked like. That session changed something between us, not in a dramatic way, in the way that understanding something true together changes two people quietly and permanently. Diane called Marcus on his birthday that spring. She sang to him over the phone, which she had done every year of his life, and he told me about it afterward with a complicated expression on his face. He said it made him sad in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Not sad about the call itself, but sad about the distance between who his mother could have been and who she had chosen to be. Sad about the years he had spent trying to close that distance by making himself responsible for her happiness. He said something that I wrote down afterward because I didn't want to forget it. He said, "I spent so long trying to be enough for her that I never stopped to ask whether she was being enough for me." There are sentences that rearrange something in you when you hear them. That was one of them. By summer, things with Diane had settled into something I would describe as functional. She called Marcus regularly, though less than before. She was cordial to me when we saw her, which was less often than it used to be. She had not repeated the key request or anything like it. She had not shown up unannounced in months. Daniel told Marcus that their mother had complained to him a few times about feeling shut out. Daniel had told her kindly but clearly that the people in her life had not shut her out, that she had simply encountered limits perhaps for the first time, and that limits were not the same as rejection. Diane had reportedly not responded well to that, but she also hadn't escalated. She was learning, perhaps, that the tactics that had worked for decades were no longer producing the results she expected, and without those tactics working, she was in unfamiliar territory. Whether unfamiliar territory would lead to genuine change, I still couldn't say with certainty. What I could say was that my life had changed, not because Diane had transformed, but because the people around her had. Marcus had changed, I had changed. My parents had quietly, firmly protected their own space without drama or confrontation. Daniel and his wife had shared their own experience and let Marcus see that he wasn't alone in what he had been navigating. And somewhere in all of that, without any single dramatic moment of resolution, the dynamic had shifted. My mother's garden grew through that summer into something genuinely beautiful. She planted tomatoes along the south fence and wildflowers near the front walk and a small herb garden just outside the kitchen door. When I visited her on weekend mornings, she would take me through it the way a person shows you something they are proud of, not boastfully, just with quiet happiness. One morning, I stood with her near the herb garden and she told me she had been thinking about putting a small bench near the back fence, a place to sit in the evenings. She said she wanted a spot that was just for her and my dad, somewhere they could be at the end of the day with no obligations and no noise. I told her it sounded perfect. She smiled and said, "It's funny, I spent so many years in apartments worrying about what the landlord would say if I changed something. Now I can put a bench wherever I want. I keep forgetting that." I thought about that on the drive home, about how long it takes some people to fully inhabit what is actually theirs, about how years of not being allowed to take up space, by landlords, by circumstances, by other people's outsized needs, can train you to keep shrinking even after the thing that caused the shrinking is gone. My parents had a home that was entirely theirs. My marriage was becoming, more fully than it had ever been, actually mine. And I was finally, after 6 years of managing and tolerating and bracing, beginning to inhabit my own life without apology. That is not a small thing, that is in fact everything. There is something nobody tells you about the aftermath of standing your ground in a family situation like this. Everyone focuses on the confrontation, the moment of truth, the hard conversation, the line drawn. What people don't talk about is what comes after. The long, unglamorous process of rebuilding what the conflict quietly eroded while you weren't paying attention. That rebuilding happened slowly for Marcus and me. It happened in small moments that individually seemed insignificant, but together added up to something I can only describe as reclamation. It happened the first Sunday we spent entirely alone. No plans, no obligations, no calls to return, just the two of us making breakfast late and reading and existing in our home without the background hum of someone else's expectations. It happened the first time Marcus's phone rang during dinner, and it was Diane, and he looked at me and said calmly that he would call her back later. Not with guilt, not with apology, just as a simple statement of fact. It happened the first time I decorated our guest room the way I had always wanted to and didn't hear a voice in the back of my mind anticipating what Diane would say about my choices. These moments sound ordinary written down, but they were not ordinary to live through. Each one felt like recovering a small piece of territory that had been gradually occupied without my full awareness or consent. Patricia, our therapist, had a phrase she used that I found myself returning to often during this period. She said that in relationships where one person has a controlling dynamic, the people around that person don't just lose autonomy in the obvious moments of conflict. They lose it in the quiet moments too, because they begin to preemptively manage themselves based on what that person might think or want or demand. She called it anticipatory shrinking. You make yourself smaller not because someone is currently pressuring you, but because you have learned to expect pressure and have started applying it to yourself in advance. I recognized myself completely in that description. I had been anticipatory shrinking for 6 years. Stopping that pattern was not as simple as deciding to stop. It was a daily practice of catching myself mid-thought and asking whether the hesitation I was feeling was genuinely mine or whether it was a habit I had developed to manage someone else. More often than I expected, the answer was the latter. Around early fall, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Diane reached out to me directly, not to Marcus, to me. She sent me a text message that was brief and careful in its wording. It said that she knew things had been difficult and that she had done some thinking and that she hoped we could have lunch together sometime, just the two of us. I sat with that message for 2 days before I responded. I showed it to Marcus, who read it twice and said the decision was entirely mine. I showed it to my mother, who read it and said, "What does your gut tell you?" I thought about Daniel's warning. I thought about the years of small erosions. I thought about the key request and the wounded silences and the daily calls and the afternoon she had walked into my parents' home uninvited and asked for access to it like it was a reasonable thing to ask. And then I thought about Marcus telling me he had spent his whole life trying to be enough for her. And I thought about my father saying the worst thing someone can do is make you feel like what you have isn't really yours. And I thought about Patricia talking about anticipatory shrinking. And I made a decision that I think surprised even me. I said yes. Not because I trusted Diane completely. Not because I believed a single lunch would undo 6 years. Not because I was certain her reach out was entirely genuine. I said yes because I had spent 6 years reacting to Diane from a position of defense, and I wanted to try something different. I wanted to see what it felt like to walk into a room with her from a position of security instead of bracing. We met at a small Italian place near my office on a Thursday afternoon. Diane was already there when I arrived, which told me she was nervous. She is not typically early. She had dressed carefully. She stood up when she saw me come in, which she had never done before. We ordered, we made small talk, and then about 20 minutes in, Diane set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It was effortful. Whatever she was about to say cost her something. She said she owed me an apology, not a specific one, not tied to the key request alone, but a larger one. She said she had spent years treating my side of Marcus's life as something she needed to monitor and manage, and that she understood now that she had caused real harm by doing that. She said she had not been welcoming to me the way she should have been. She said she had felt threatened by how close Marcus and I were, and that instead of examining that feeling honestly, she had acted on it in ways she wasn't proud of. I listened to all of it without interrupting.